Cool. This was the last talk, and now we're going to get all the Facebook speakers and members of the React team coming on stage for a Q&A about, if you have any questions about all the things that we announced, and React Core, React 0.13, feel free to hit them up. And there's a timer at the back of the room, which says 30. So when it's going to hit 0, you're all going to get access to React Native. So watch for it. And please get to the mics if you have any questions. I'm sure you all have questions. It's not possible without it.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, so CSS layout seems really, really cool.
Yeah.
How do I get started with it today? What's the recommended sort of approach to?
So why do you want to use it?
Why?
Yeah.
So I really like the idea of the inline styles.
Okay,
right?
so you can use inline style using React. Even the first version we open sourced, you can already use it.
Yeah.
And now if you're in the browser, you can use the browser to do margin padding flexbox. So this project is really for React Native when you don't have an implementation of flexbox.
So I was thinking it would be cool if you had components in your hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And they know about other components, they could compute their padding and their positioning, and you could just use absolute positioning for everything, and then that would be based on their parents, and they could automatically compute that as well. That's a little bit more.
Okay, so if you want to throw it out, hit me up at the end.
Okay.
Come on. There's no question. Yeah, feel free to go to the mics.
Hi. So I've seen some proposals for web workers, and this native stuff is just entirely the exact same architecture that I was thinking that we might be doing. Are there any plans for that, or is it just kind of a fun idea?
Yeah, there's definitely a plan for that. It's more experimental at this point, and the architecture is slightly different. It's a way to think about React on two sides of a worker. The initial web worker stuff that Pete Hunt did was similar in the sense that it had a web worker running React, but on the other side, there was no React. It was just a DOM. So it went from React to an asynchronous imperative API. And that's the same model as React Native. The model that I'm thinking about now is React on both sides of the worker. And how would you do things like deep updates and stuff like that? And how would you, because currently React bottoms out. That's very experimental, but it could allow us things like having very slow components run on a different worker and very critical components running on a different worker, and they're not colliding with each other.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Sebastian Mark Page. And I'm sorry.
He's sorry for point 12.
So my question is, there's been a lot of talks in this conference about targeting things other than the browser DOM. And of course, React Native is all about targeting other things than the browser DOM. Has there been any talk of implementing something like React outside of JavaScript to extend the range of potential targets further to things like GTK?
Yeah.
So a funny thing, React was actually originally built in standard ML. Jordan couldn't make it work, so he decided to use JavaScript instead. There has been talk of this, though.
I can give a more...
Yeah,
I give a more practical answer. What's up? So I worked on our iOS team for a couple of years, and our newsfeed code was really hard to work with and extremely brittle. And I really wanted to deploy the ideas of React to it. And actually, we started this project about a year ago, and the React Native was like a twinkle in our eye. And we're like, maybe this can be React Native. It was just too early. And it was also before Swift, so we had very little tools. So we actually took the concepts of React, it was not a direct port, but we took the concepts of React, and we put it into iOS. So we actually have sort of the same idea of wrapper APIs that target native elements, and a function where data goes in, and representations of views come out, and reconciliation, much dumber model of reconciliation because we're time limited. it's not something that we can open source in its current form. But yes, you can take the ideas of React and you can put them in other environments. It works.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
And this project is called iOS Components, and there's a talk last month or something. Yeah.
So at Scale, our at Scale conference, which was, I can't even remember when it was, but like end of last year. Actually, Adam Ernst and Ari Grant, I think, presented about iOS components. It's awesome. We use it for, if you've ever used Facebook's newsfeed on iOS, any feed, the whole app is all powered by something that looks and feels very much like React.
Cool. Yep.
I'll take the next one. Great talks, guys. Much appreciated. So there's been a lot of thought put into the rendering mechanics on the client, making a great browser experience. I have not seen quite as much thought put into the isomorphic properties, the server-side rendering component. And so what I'm actually seeing is the server-side performance is at least comparable to other rendering systems that you would use on the server. It's actually pretty bad. And getting into the details, I'm finding that there's a lot of stuff that just really doesn't make any sense to be on the server-side rendering. So are there any like future thinking thoughts on how to address that, or if it's even important to the framework at all?
Maybe Jing and Dan?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about how we use server-side JavaScript with Relay. So for the web version that we're building, there's actually multiple modes. So in the default mode, I guess in the normal mode that you would expect, you can run everything on the client. But that would actually require a separate round trip to the server for data once everything comes up. So what we do is we run on the server to generate the query to start with, and then we run that query on the server as well. And what we send down to the client is all of the JavaScript you need to do the rendering, plus all of the data that you already have fetched. So that's one mode. And then in the other mode, we actually have server rendering as well. So you get both the markup and the data that's needed for your page. But that, I think, is actually less efficient because you see your markup really early, but everything gets hooked up a little bit later. So there's sort of a spectrum of what we would do there in terms of like which mode is best. And I think both have actually worked pretty well for us so far.
Well, I'm more referring to where server-side rendering is actually required for SEO and related reasons. So the actual React rendering step itself.
So, funny story about server rendering. It wasn't actually designed that way.
I can tell.
It just happened that the fastest way to implement it on the client also happened to be the fastest way to run it on the server at the time, or the simplest way, basically generate a string. We don't use it that heavily, which is why we haven't really invested strongly in it. But there's definitely a lot of things we can do there. We can avoid, for example, auto binding comes with some cost, even though you're not expecting any callbacks at all. There's things we can do by ignoring any state that gets set up for each continuous loop, so you don't create this giant tree of state that you're never going to use again for the first reconciliation. And we'd love to have support from companies that are actually using this stuff. And I'd like to see some pull requests coming in for this, because that would be great.
I agree.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks.
All right. Can you hear me?
Mike?
For React components, there's state, there's props, and then there's this mythical thing called context. What can I expect? Can I expect this to stick around? And yeah, what's up with that?
Sebastian, I told you they were going to find it.
Yeah, it will stick around. We're adding a warning in 0.13 that basically says that if you're using it in the sense that you're getting it from the owner instead of the parent. This is a very obscure concept in React, the difference between an owner and a parent. Basically, a parent is the thing that directly renders it. But the thing that actually renders it is not what creates the element. So the thing that creates the element is the owner. There's a subtle difference there. And nobody really relies on the owner, and actually adds a lot of complications. So we're going to change that to be parent-based. We're also looking into a different reconciliation algorithm because updates don't work that they should now if you have should component update, because any intermediate component can't reason about them. So we're going to do a different reconciliation just for context. We might also change the API a little bit to make it easier to work with for static typing. But other than that, yes, the concept of a context will stay.
Thanks.
There's actually a funny. Do you want to tell a story about where that came from? I mean, there's actually an interesting story in our PHP stack, or actually our XHP stack, for where context came from. So that was an idea that we borrowed from XHP, and there was a couple of valid use cases we found on the server where we actually needed something to be passed down through the entire XHP tree. It's the same as a React component tree, but we didn't want to. We wanted to be completely opaque because we didn't want engineers building anything deep in the tree to understand anything about this. One example of this was link cache busting. So we built the ability to basically have, we couldn't make something that was global, but we needed something that was like, specific to a particular render tree, and we wanted it to be passed down in case there's ever a link that got rendered. We also use it so that we could like bust caches in CDNs and in ISPs. Actually, that's a funnier long story. But also, like, you could use it for another thing we use it for was like logging data. So we needed whenever you click a link, we needed that to log, for example, ad impressions and things like that. But it has to be completely opaque because if anybody was able to mess with that, even just by passing it through the tree, it's like more overhead. So we found a couple valid use cases for something called context on the server. In XHP, I'm not sure what we called it. We call it context?
Yeah, it's called XContext in
XContext.
XHP. It actually comes with the library. The open source library has XContext.
What were the other? There was a bunch of other valid use cases.
I think the one that was the most awesome was, so we have this thing called viewer that runs through the whole system. And viewer is just who are you logged in as. And in the olden days of Facebook, this was just like a global. You could call a function and you get back some user ID that who's logged in. Then we built this feature where people didn't understand privacy. So you would go to your profile and say, I can see everything. Well, of course you can. It's your profile. Okay, let's build in a field so you can type in your friend's name or anyone's name, and we'll show you what the profile would look like to them. So we build this with XHP, and we have this idea that you can just get context, and then people have some component, and they're like, oh, I need to render the messages box. I better grab whoever's logged in right now, and then render the right thing. So we had to understand the difference between who's logged in versus who's viewing the profile and who's allowed to do what, and then different sections of the UI might be logged in as different people in that case. It was really, we couldn't figure out how to build it until we realized, oh, this is just a subtree of our UI. And if we can pass a new global just for that subtree, then we solve this problem. And I think actually that's where XContext first popped in. But we ended up using it. We found all kinds of interesting places to use it.
And there's a few interesting use cases in just UI development and client side as well. Like focus and selection are two very global states, but most people don't really care about it in their components. But currently, you have to work very imperatively in React to handle focus and selection. You get a ref and call focus on it or something like that, right? So we're thinking that could potentially be implemented as context. One warning, though, there's a bunch of use cases where context is valid. The one where it's not is to save you typing and passing props down. Everyone that gets annoyed by React passes props down a lot, and then they want context to solve that problem. That causes more problems than it solves. So I would consider restructuring your app in a way that you can pass components through other components rather than having every component render a bunch of other components.
Cool. Hey there. Super excited about React Native. One of the things, but I had a question sort of, whenever we've used or looked at frameworks in the past that sort of wrap in one way or another native OSs, there's this danger that iOS, new Android comes out with lots of new features, and then you're sort of at a disadvantage. Now, it sounds like with the bridging, maybe we can just sort of write native code that we'd bridge to that would use the new features. But I'm also interested in sort of seeing if you guys if y'all have a plan for how you're going to support new OS features or any sort of commitment or plan, or is it the community that's going to be working on that?
Yeah, so there's actually two approaches to every component. You can do what we call internally, you can either wrap or you can re-implement. There's cases in native when you want to re-implement. So for example, I don't think this is an unknown, or I don't think this is not public, but the tab bar at the bottom of the Facebook iOS app is actually like a re-implementation of that in native. And so there's times when you want to be able to re-implement and get more flexibility that the native widgets can't provide. But the wrapping is perhaps more flexible because as long as the public API of that thing doesn't change, you can actually create a wrapper that would work across, for example, an OS update. And let's say that in iOS 6 to iOS 7, the look and feel changed of the native navigator, but the API to that thing didn't change. It's still the iOS navigator. You would basically get that for free if you're doing just wrapping. But if we're using our re-implementation of the tab bar, well, when iOS 8 comes out or iOS 7 comes out, obviously we need to re-implement that thing to look and feel like the new operating system. So I don't think you're never going to get this 100% for free. Anytime there's an operating system update, you have to update your app to look like it. I still have apps on my phone that are useful that look like iOS 6 because it's just like the developer just doesn't maintain them anymore. But you have to do a little bit of work. But I think the thing that makes this different is now you kind of have the option of, do I want to re-implement and get a little bit more flexibility using JavaScript, more control in JavaScript, or do I want to wrap and then potentially get that upgrade for free? So it's kind of up to the developer.
Cool. One thing that I add to that is that what we're trying to do is not just make it as fast. We want to make it better to work with, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the existing APIs aren't the best APIs for implementing the components, right? So re-implementing also gives you the opportunity to build a better API and more flexible API.
I would say not better API, but better design for a declarative API that's coming from React.
Declarative is always better.
Yeah. I also have another example of that too. It's pretty interesting. In iOS UI Kit, you can't specify like a border bottom on something. So the way in Newsfeed that we separate, Newsfeed stories is we create another view that has a height of 1 or like pixel ratio over 2 or whatever, and then we just put the view with the width in the thing. But what we can do is we can abstract that away into our view class and say, oh, now when you use this CSS layout thing, you specify border bottom. The way that that's implemented under the hood, I don't know, who cares? What we do is we draw a line for you, but you can't do that. So we can add functionality and flexibility to existing components and widgets and things that you couldn't otherwise do easily.
Chris, do you want to mention the upgrade path between iOS and Android? That re-implementation?
No.
Well,
I don't have anything to say.
So certain views only exist in one platform, right? Yeah. So if you build an application specifically for iOS and then you want to port it to Android, what re-implementation allows us to do is, even if we're not re-implementing it perfectly, we can swap in the re-implementation on Android, which gives you a sort of working model, but so you can incrementally update your app without it just instantly crashing.
Thanks.
Yeah, Jed.
Hey. So mixins are awesome. And they're useful for a bunch of things, particularly because they, I guess combine things in weird ways that you're not expecting, but once you understand it, it becomes really powerful, particularly if you're creating a framework or something like React Router, which uses context, and then you can drop a mixin in and your navigation works. Now, I've heard that we're not going to be able to use them anymore.
So that's not quite true. So to give you a little backstory about this, in ECMAScript 6, I'm on the TC39 committee, there was a plan to implement some hooks for mixins because nobody knows really how to do mixins well. There's a bunch of different implementations of mixins in various languages, and there's no standard for it. What happened was that ECMAScript 6 needs to be standardized and finalized. So all those things were ripped out of the spec. And because they're ripped out, there's no real nice way to do mixins in a cohesive way for ECMAScript 6. However, it's also being pushed to become a high priority for ECMAScript 7, and ECMAScript is moving to a train model, which means that it's yearly basis. So that means we will get mixins back in ECMAScript. And they're not going away in React because we still have React.create class and we still have the proprietary model for React. What I would say is that the way I see mixins, and Lee can disagree with me later, is that they're a great way to experiment, like you say, with features that we haven't implemented in the framework, and you can add things to it. But a lot of those features are things we should be building into the framework, and once we do, there's better ways to do it with separate namespaces that don't collide. And 99% of the use cases for Mixins right now is just adding subscriptions to external data, either if it's a Flux store, an RX subscription, a channel, or something like that, right? And we can add that as a first-class concept, get rid of 99% of the Mixins, and then figure out other solutions for things like routers. And then we can still have the support for Mixins, but there should be more of an edge case, not a primary way to solve any kind of abstraction.
So what's the TLDR? Should we use Mixins or should we not?
You continue using Mixins until there's a better solution for it.
Okay. Cool.
For every use case.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm super excited, by the way, about the typing. And by the way, this is the best conference I've been in ever. There hasn't been a talk I hadn't had something to take home and think about.
Nice.
And one question I have is, I see the syntax you do for Flow in React. And I see that when you define the type, you don't define the default values inside. And I wanted to ask you why and if you're thinking about moving that there. Because you define the properties at the type, and then you have to define the default values separately.
So you're talking about merging the default value and the type of the value.
Yep.
Yeah. This has come up a lot in the past. And the reason we haven't really done that is because of how it affects static typing, where you don't want these to be conflated. One is a static concept that will be eliminated at runtime, and there's reasons for why static type systems like Flow wants them to be eliminated completely. If you do something like Angular's injections, you still want to keep them, but that also comes with the trade-off. That's basically the reason, but you can imagine a type annotation language that lets you annotate them inline. But that's sort of the exploration in the type system space.
I could even imagine the compiler itself separating that and taking the default values and putting that in your get default props method, and that will just solve some typing and make the syntax more clear, in my eyes.
Yeah, that's something we can look at. I think that whatever we want to do there, we want to explore in the terms of Flow and TypeScript, and unify a type annotation syntax for JavaScript, and we're working closely with other companies to make that happen.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes. Yeah. Oh, you go first? Yeah. Go.
Thanks. First of all, great conference, guys. I found out about Webpack because of Pete Hunt, and he has a repo called Webpack How-To, which is a great name for a repo. And I was just wondering, is that what you guys use to bundle up your components in your build steps for a lot of the complicated stuff that you build? And if so, do you guys have any tips on how to make your stuff really small?
Yeah, so we don't use Webpack for Facebook.com. The thing that we use is actually a system called, we have a packager, and then we have two systems, one called Haste, which does our dependency management, and one called Make Haste, which actually does all our transformations. We have a lot of transformations that actually aren't part of React, that aren't public, because they're just tied to our infrastructure. So we have like an internationalization transformation. We have transformations for GraphQL. And there's a bunch of other that are kind of proprietary. But the way that this system works is actually pretty interesting. Our packager uses machine learning. So what we do is we log production data for anybody that accesses. I know, it's pretty cool. We log production CDN access anytime anybody requests a package. We log that it was used, and then we put all of that into a big database. And then once a week we process that, and we figure out what next week's site is very likely to need based on that, and we package everything up optimally based on that. Over the years since I started, this packager has gone through a bunch of different iterations, and we've kind of zeroed in on, I love using the phrase damped harmonic oscillator. We've kind of zeroed in on kind of like the most optimized version of this packager. So When we started, we experimented with all sorts of different features, and one of the features was like rate of change of the file. So if a file never changed, we would say, okay, that should just be inside of our core, what we called the prelude package, and like that'll always go down to every browser. It'll never change, and we'll always send that in the same package, and hopefully never invalidate the cache, and blah 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 blah. The other, also we just, as things changed and dependencies changed, we would send down new packages every week. But one thing that we found that was really interesting a very long time ago was, and perhaps I'm going too far into this story here. The answer is no, we don't use Webpack. But so one thing that we found was whenever we tried to optimize for something that was related to browser caches, it actually never affected our metrics at all. Because what we found is 90-some% of the time, all statistics are made up on the spot, most of the time we were hitting cold caches, right? Users had cold caches and they were hitting the site, or enough of the cache was invalidated that like the cache didn't matter. What we found was that actually profile pictures invalidated our browser caches for JavaScript, which was somewhat frustrating. This is a while back. I'm dating myself. So this system actually just lives on. We haven't replaced it yet. We've talked about replacing it, and actually we're starting to look into that now. I don't think we would necessarily be able to replace it with something that exists already out of the box, because we do have to take production logging data into account. But the way that I envision this system working, and Lee, you can provide a little bit of context on some of the experiments we've done so far, is we basically we log all that data in a standard format that's like, here's all the dependencies, and hopefully eventually in real time we'll be able to generate packages based on real-time usage data and based on the dependency graph. But do you want to talk a little bit about what you and Amjad have been working on?
I mean, that really sums up pretty much all the awesome parts of it.
Cool. So talk about the shitty parts now.
I can kind of talk about the shitty parts of it. So that's how the packager stuff works. That's actually the interesting part. The other thing that a couple folks at Facebook have been working on is how we package up the JavaScript for React Native, which is obviously really different from how we'd package it for the desktop, where you don't care about like bouncing between URLs. And for that, it's much more about the developer experience. And in that way, it's much more similar to Webpack. But we're not using Webpack.
Okay, next question.
Yeah.
So we have lots of different targets for React. We have phones and tablets, all different sizes. We've got desktops of different sizes, and now now there's all these different things. Netflix. What are some good strategies for doing responsive apps? Also, not only just with the layout or CSS, but only fetching the things you need, like on mobile. If you've got a small device, you're not getting some things. And how do you build that? You build that into the components. You use different components. What are some strategies you guys use for that kind of thing?
So for data fetching, Jing or Dan can talk about Relay. Oh. Okay. Don't talk about anything. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. In Relay, we actually allow you to defer queries. So what that means is you can. For example, you can load newsfeed and just load the stories themselves, and you can mark sort of the rest of it, the comment box, as optional, so that will come down separately. So that will basically allow your page to be faster while still getting all of the data. You just get it a little bit later. You can do the same thing if you have a view that you're primarily looking at, but then you want to load data that's sort of below the fold. You can do that as a defer so that it's there when the user starts scrolling, but it's not sort of blocking the first piece of the page.
Cool. Good. Next question.
Saw in the React Native demo this morning as the compile went through that RocksDB was in there.
Yeah.
And so I just was curious if that's what you guys were using for data things with React Native, or if you've tried out other things, or what the deal is there.
So we're actually experimenting with using RocksDB for caching from Relay, so that right now everything in Relay just sort of lives in memory, and if you close the app, it kind of goes away. I think for a more performant app, we definitely want to save it to the client, and then to disk, and then load it back up when the app comes back up.
So I work over at SurveyMonkey on the mobile team, and we love React, but one of the main reasons we started using it was we wanted a cross-platform renderer for Android and iOS within a web view. And now with this whole React Native thing, I was wondering if there are any plans to allow And so one of the main reasons we did that, to backtrack, is that we have a lot of user-generated HTML, user-generated styles that we needed to render in a web view, or we thought we did. Are there any plans to allow users to render HTML using React Native?
No.
Well, I just saw a demo from Jed. Where's Jed? Jed, raise your hand. Keystone. Yeah, I'll just plug Keystone for him. So he just showed me the best looking and feeling implementation of this that I've seen. And like, there's a really good comment on Hacker News last night that I'm going to use this question to plug. Somebody said, this guy just doesn't get it. They're talking about me. Duh.
It's true.
And they said, no, it was really well articulated though. He said, most users, they don't notice this stuff like designers do. And I think that there's some truth to that, but
20 seconds.
20 seconds. All right. So basically what I'm trying to say is you can build something that feels really, really good using those technologies. There's always subtle differences. It's very, very hard to get it right, but Keystone is a great approach. You should try it.
I'll add one last detail. You can wrap any native component, including UI WebView.
Nice.
And it's done.
And we did that.
Property, inner HTML,
Yeah.
You're done.
And we did it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Go build
James,
something.
Come on, go.
Or drink.
Okay, look at your mails.
He did it live.
Nice. Oh.